Okay, so today we are going to be covering dynamic posing. And what is a dynamic pose? Well, a dynamic pose is very similar to a gesture drawing, except it takes it a step further, where a gesture drawing takes the basic shapes and breaks everything down into those basic shapes to try and capture a person really quickly, like we have here. Well, a dynamic drawing or a dynamic pose goes a little bit further than that. And you have to have a very strong foundation for the basics of gesture drawing and anatomy before you can even begin to do dynamic posing. And dynamic posing, it is a way for artists to show in more detail and more emotion what's going on in the artwork. So the examples that we have here are typical gesture drawings. Now, what I'm about to show you is a dynamic pose. A dynamic pose typically goes off of a shape first off. So I start off with an S here, and you build off that shape to make whatever you're going to draw. And this has a nice fluid motion that goes through the artwork of whatever you're drawing, and it really captures a movement as well as the eye and attention of the viewer. And dynamic poses, while they're really neat, it requires you to have a strong foundation in the basics, because you're pretty much not forgetting what you've learned before, but taking it to a totally new level. And that's why it's important to fully understand how to do gesture drawings and how anatomy and distance and structuring works. So I'm going to be flipping through my sketchbook here, and I'm going to be showing you a few examples of dynamic posing, what it is and what it's not. So this right here is a study on perspective, and you can see that they're very rigid, and the reason for that is because they're still sticking to that basic frame, keeping everything in line. You have the basic sections broken down, and even this character here is still very rigid. This right here is more rigid, while this is more dynamic. And you can see it just kind of has this S shape, as does this right here. So you can see that even though this might look more complicated, in actuality this looks more convincing because it has that S shape that drags your eye through. Since you don't have to have an S shape, you could just have a shape like this, where the angle of the form is followed through that. So it's almost like it's just going up, and that is the area it's following. This is a dynamic pose, while this right here is more of a rigid pose. You still have sort of the angle that you're looking at, but it's more based on the different portions of the body and not necessarily the shape that it's taking. Just like this right here is actually more of a dynamic pose. You can see that it's kind of a elongated S. That's dynamic, while this would be more rigid. And this would also be an example of dynamic. This is an example of dynamic pose as well, because you have an S shape that starts here, comes up, curves around, and then goes back down. While this is neat, not a dynamic pose. Very rigid, not dynamic. Also very rigid, not dynamic. On the other hand, this would be a good example of dynamic, because you can see it has a snaky S motion that curves around and leads your eye through. That is a dynamic pose. So that leads me to your lesson for the day. Now, this week we're going to be covering dynamic posing, but before we can get into that, you have to know how to do the basic structures. And for that, what we're going to be doing, we are going to be having a crash course going through gesture drawing, so you all can remember and remind yourself how to do that. It's always good practice to do. So the first day we're going to be recapping on gesture drawing, which is basically this right here, where you have a circle for the head, a triangle going for the body, circle for the joints in the arms, all the bendable areas connected with the line. Triangle again for the waist. And then go on down with the feet and legs. That is a gesture drawing. You're going to be doing gesture drawings for the first day. We're going to have a video. There's a video going to be playing directly after this, more than likely, where you are going to be following along and drawing them. You are going to have a set amount of time for each picture, and each picture I want you to try and draw a gesture drawing as best as you can. Start off with this, and if you can migrate to something like this, then absolutely try and do that, because the better you get at this, the better you're going to get at doing that. All right, if you have any questions, please let me know. I'm going to go ahead and start the transition of images. Thank you all. Have a great rest of your day.